Everybody, thank you again for joining this second part of our Media Day adventure. Actually, I should say the third part. And very excited to have a cicerone here, Ian Colston from Brown's Distribution Company. And he is going to do about a 15-minute presentation on a beer flight. As you know, in the past years, what we've done with both festivals is we've included beer flights. And there's some philosophies around them, and so we like to offer different varieties. And Ian is going to share some cicerone information about the beers. And for those of you who are not familiar with what a cicerone is, because you're hearing me say this term, a cicerone is the credentials given to people who study beer. It's very similar to the sommelier program with the wines. There is now an established cicerone program, and so Ian has worked very hard, you know, tasting all these different crafts and whatnot to be able to understand a little bit more about beer. So Ian, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. All right, so the biggest challenge I'm going to have with this is actually not rambling on for an hour. I'm a pretty big beer nerd, and I tend to talk a lot, so you can just give me a cue to speed it along. So, but really want to focus on what you're about to taste in front of you. It's pretty cool getting to see all of you out here. A lot of you have websites or blogs that I pay attention to, so it's actually kind of cool seeing all your credentials. So let's talk about beer. Let's try some beer, and then I'll kind of go through the process of how we make beer, what beer is made of. How many people in here, real quick, know about beer, like consider themselves beer aficionados? Nobody. You're a beer snob. All right, excellent. One person that this is you're going to know all this stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about beer, but first we're going to taste beer, because I could talk about beer for a half an hour and then we have no time to taste. So everybody, hold up number one. First thing I'm going to teach you to do is how to properly taste beer, right? We're going to get a little snooty here, but it's important. So first thing you need to do is you need to look at the color. Hold it up to the light. See what we would call that, like a straw color, maybe like a light gold color. All right, go ahead and take a sip. When I say take a sip, you need to kind of swish it around in your mouth a little bit. You need to not just do a quick sip. I don't care if you don't like beer or not. You've got to at least try it. You've got to let it coat the inside of your mouth. Then you swallow, exhale through the nose. That'll give you like that nice burst of aroma. That's how you taste beer. You should also smell it first. I probably skipped right over that. So that is Orlando Brewing Blonde Ale. Can anybody give me some flavors that they're picking up? Citrus, okay. Anything else?
Nuttiness.
Huh? Nuttiness? Okay, yeah. These are all correct, right? So you're going to have like a nice kind of bready characteristic from the malt. Almost kind of, I almost detect like a little bit of like raw doughy. You're going to get that from the malt itself, and I'm going to explain what malt is in a second. Citrus is going to come from your hop characteristic, or maybe your yeast, but primarily hops. The nuttiness is going to come from your malt profile as well. So beer's four main ingredients. You have malt, well, some kind of grain. Most of the time, all the time, it's got malt base to it. You've got hops, which are the spice additive in beer. You've got water, and you've got yeast. So the backbone of everything is the malt. Malt is what gives beer its color and its primary flavor that you're going to get the most of. So, and what malt is it's barley. And it's barley that's been tricked into growing and getting some sugars working, some enzymes going, that we can take that sugar and turn it into alcohol. Sugar is the basis of alcohol. What does that is the yeast. We talk about yeast as a living organism. It consumes the sugars, and its byproduct is alcohol and carbonation. So that's where your carbonation comes from. That's where your alcohol comes from. It comes from yeast consuming the sugar. Hops are like a vine-growing plant, and they're little cones. They look like little green pine cones, and we use those to kind of add a bitterness, like a bittering backbone to a beer, because without it, all beer would just be kind of like sickeningly sweet and have no balance to it. And then water, I don't really have to explain water, right? Everybody, I mean, it's, you know. So That is Orlando Brewing Blonde Ale. The whole idea of a blonde ale is to make something really light and quenchable, something that's appealing to a broad base of palates. Everybody can drink a blonde ale. If you like, if you like your pilsners and your light lagers and stuff like that, a blonde ale is a great gateway beer into craft beer. Does everybody like this one?
Yeah.
Think it's perfect for a hot day, right? All right, so let's taste the next one, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Florida beer movement, because all of these beers happen to be from Florida. So the next one, once again, hold up to the light. Give a sniff. A couple of quick sniffs, don't do a long like that. You're going to overload your nasal palate. And then exhale through the nose after you swallow. There's a lot going on in this one. So you've got, the thing that hits my palate first is caramel.
Clove.
Clove, okay. A little bit of spice, yeah. And then it's got kind of like that bitterness on the back end to it. That's the hops kind of just bringing it into balance. It's not an overly bitter beer, but it's just a well-balanced beer. But caramel is like the primary thing that's getting you there. You get a little bit of more sweetness out of the tongue than on the blonde ale. And that's what when we use caramel malts, which is, we take that malt and then you can cook it to varying degrees. The more you cook it, the darker the beer is going to get. When you actually use it in there, the sweeter it's going to get up to a point. And this is from Three Daughters Brewing Company out of St. Pete. So all of these beers are Florida beers. The focus on this is Florida beers, which is that's primarily what I do for a living. I work for a distribution company but my job is just handling Florida beers, and it's really cool to see what's gone on in Florida. By and large, we've been behind the rest of the nation in terms of craft beer growth. These smaller breweries kind of taking over and making full-bodied, full-flavored beers for.
Why is Florida lagging?
Huh?
Why is Florida lagging behind compared to other regions?
There's a lot of theories on that. My personal one is just we happen to be a very big transplant state. There's not a heck of a lot of people that are from Florida who are born in Florida. So it takes a while for us to kind of catch up because there's not, with the exception of a couple of patches, there's not like a deep-seated kind of cultural community here because we're a state of transplants. That's my theory. A lot of people have different theories though. But what's really cool is now we're starting to play catch-up. We're absolutely changing. You can look in the Jacksonville area, and there's an explosion of breweries up there. I think we talked about 8 now. Tampa, I can't even keep count of the breweries that are popping up in Tampa, and it seems like every time I turn around, there's another brewery popping up in the Tampa-St. Pete area. Starting to get a few cropping up here in Orlando, with Orlando Brewing being the oldest one of them. So it's really cool to see, be a part of this growth in the state right now. So everybody like that one? All right. Anybody have any questions about the beer so far? You can ask questions, please. Makes it easier for me. I'm a conversationalist.
How cold should the beer be?
Okay, so that's a good question. How cold should the beer be? There's a lot of answers. The right answer is however cold you want it to be, right? So the warmer a beer is going to be, the more you're going to be able to pick up aroma, the more you're going to be able to pick up flavor once it hits your tongue. It's, when you talk about serving ice-cold beer, no disrespect to the large manufacturers of beer out there, and they talk about ice-cold beer, they say that because if you let it warm up, it's not going to taste so good. You're going to get a lot of flavors that you don't want. I'm a craft beer snob, though, so don't take it personal if I'm insulting your beer. But as these warm up, you're going to get more and more flavor coming out of them, and it's going to be pleasant flavors. You're going to be able to just detect, your palate's going to be able to detect more. So right now, these beers were poured a little bit ago. They're not a refrigerated temperature, like straight out of the refrigerator, but you're also able to taste a lot more of what's going on now. So, and that was, what we just had was the channel marker red out of Three Daughters, and that's, red ales are kind of like, if you take an amber ale and just step it up a little bit, add a little bit more caramel malt, it's going to get darker in color, it's going to get a little sweeter. All right, this one is very interesting. Number 3, Feast of Flowers Farmhouse Ale. This is from Florida Beer Company out of the Cape Canaveral area. Spicy, yes. When you smell that, some of the notes I get, you get spicy, kind of floral, some tea, absolutely. Almost kind of like chai, maybe, something like that. So this is what's called a farmhouse style ale, or a saison. This is an old Belgian style beer. And a saison, one of the primary characteristics is that it really has no characteristics other than being warm fermented, which I can get into the minutia of that, but I'll just bore you all to tears. But the warmer you ferment a beer, which fermentation is the process of the yeast consuming sugar and creating alcohol, the warmer you ferment, temperature-wise, the more esters and aromas, and that bouquet is just going to open up. So this is going to be fermented a little bit warmer than the rest of the beers on the table, and as a consequence, the yeast is going to give off some more byproducts that we're detecting. The other cool thing about this beer is it's made with spices and flowers added to it. And all of the spices and flowers that are added to it are actually native to Florida. The brewmaster utilized a lot, but primarily hibiscus is why they call it Feast of Flowers. There's actually brewed with hibiscus, which is very cool. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this beer, and it's all pleasant stuff. It's all, you could probably spend a good 30 minutes picking out different flavors and aromas as it continues to warm up, as your palate continues to get used to it, and you'll kind of move on to the next cool flavor profile in it. It's a very interesting and complex beer.
Are we getting ration of alcohol levels?
Huh?
Like blonde, is that a lower?
Yeah, so the blonde is, I believe specifically it was mentioned at 4.7%. I would guess that the channel marker red ale is somewhere right in the 5% range. This tastes like it's a little bit stronger. I don't have the actual notes on what the alcohol is on this particular one, but I would guess over 6. I wouldn't put it much higher than that, though. Traditionally speaking, saisons are farmhouse-style beers. Cool historical tidbit is they were originally brewed for farm workers out in the fields, and it was a great way to pay your farm workers, sustain them throughout the day, because beer was cheaper to make than a lot of food in many instances back in the day. And they traditionally were brewed very, very low in alcohol. We don't really do that with our saisons anymore, but traditionally saisons were like 2%, maybe 3%. So it was just enough liquid bread to sustain their workers throughout the day, but not high enough alcohol to get them hammered where they couldn't do their job. So the last one, we have Cigar City. How many people have heard of Cigar City Brewing? All right. Cigar City is the largest microbrewery in the state of Florida. They're out of Tampa. They're by far the most famous coming out of Florida. They do some crazy adventurous stuff. This is one of their flagship beers. This is the High Lie IPA. Now, before you taste it, how many people have ever had an IPA before? Okay, a good chunk of people have had IPAs before, so I don't really have to. For those of you who haven't, it's going to be a bitter beer. And that's because we use a lot of those hops in the beer. Now, when you think of bitter in beer, sometimes you're thinking of off-flavor, skunkiness that is not actually bitterness. If you like a good cup of coffee is going to have a quality bitterness to it. Same thing with an IPA or India Pale Ale style beer. It's going to be hoppy, it's going to be bitter. You're going to get some citrus notes. I get a little bit of pine on the nose, and there's some tropical fruit, and a lot of that's coming from the hops. So there's some caramel notes in there because we are using a little bit of caramel malt. There's a little bit of sweetness on that end. The ABV on this one, alcohol by volume, is actually around 7%. It's just slightly over 7% usually. But yeah, this is a great beer. It's got a lot of that bitter. I'm a big bitter beer guy. I know most people are not. How many people like it? You guys like it? You're not going to offend me if you don't. Okay, cool. So I will say it's an acquired taste. When I first started drinking beer, I did not like the super bitter beers. It took me maybe a year to kind of work into them. So one day I just kind of woke up and I'm like, man, I'm really craving an IPA. Huh?
That's what I was thinking. It's not as hoppy as...
It's bitter.
You're right. You're right.
Some that I've had and didn't enjoy.
And one of the reasons for that is it's got a really solid malt profile to it that brings the beer into balance. It's kind of like a teeter-totter, and the more you raise the hops, the more you've got to raise the malt if you want to bring the beer into balance. Now, there are plenty of beers that are out of balance and intentionally brewed that way that are super, super hoppy. So they're like way over here. It's way weighted. So it's all depending on what the brewmaster's trying to do. I mean, there's a reason why, you know, this beer sells like hotcakes. It's because it's a very balanced beer and it's not overly bitter to a lot of palates. But it is significantly bitter if you're used to drinking the typical domestic lagers that are available. It's significantly more bitter. But
Well, there was, when I tasted this one the other day, it actually, and I'm dumb, I'm like communicative, but it tasted like, it reminded me of the cicerone or grapefruit.
yeah, so that's
Even like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc.
So that's a good observation. So the hops are what's doing that. The hops will bring, in addition to bitterness, hops will bring like they can bring a variety of flavors to a beer and aromas to a beer, but the primary ones in this will add like a tropical fruit and a citrus aroma and flavor profile to it. And like I said, I get a little bit of pine too. And that depends on where the hops are grown, where the hops are, where they originated from. So you've got a few major hop growing regions across the world. You've got pretty much all of Europe and England. You've got the Northwest and the Northwest United States, and then a pocket of Australia, New Zealand. And those are actually very tropical fruity that come out of that region. So IPA, does anybody know what that means? India Pale Ale, the story behind it. I'll explain that real quick because once again, cool little tidbit fact. So back when England colonized back when England colonized India, my bad, they had a hard time getting the pale ales, which were very popular at the time, to ship all the way down South Africa and over to India. They would spoil by the time it got there. So you had a bunch of cranky soldiers. So they had to figure out a way, how are we going to get our pale ales over there? So they figured out a way. One is increase the alcohol, which is a natural preservative. So you've made a stronger beer, it would stand the test of time across that voyage. The other one is actually increase the hop content, because the alpha acids in the hops are actually a natural antibacterial agent and prevent the growth of bugs to a degree. So they figured, make the beer stronger, make the beer hoppier, more bitter, and all of a sudden it's going to make that trip. And lo and behold, it made the trip, made everybody, all the colonial forces in India very happy, and they started popping it open back home, and a new style was born. So, any other questions?
So we're talking about Florida beers today. Do you see a trend from anywhere from like Old St. Jacksonville, Cigar City in Tampa, Funky Buddha in Fort Lauderdale, to even Cask and Lager here? Do you see a trend of like Florida beers or anything that has something that's very unique to Florida, or are they just trying all the different types of beers or all the different?
I would say more than any specific like trends in Florida, each brewery will actually pick their own focus.
Okay.
So you'll have Funky Buddha that they do great beers, and then they do a lot of great treatment beers too, where they'll do some crazy like blueberry cobbler and sort of crazy stuff like
bacon
that.
coffee style.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Every brewery kind of tries to pick their own identity and fill that, whatever, you just kind of look at the market and you say, what's missing and what can I do really well? And you kind of put those two things together, and that can be kind of your direction. The cool thing about having breweries that are so small too is they can sort of change and adapt as times progress. And I think one of the breweries that does that very well so far is Cigar City. They have no problems coming up with new recipes that people are clamoring for. And it keeps attention on the stuff that they've always made and always made very well. So that's kind of like the twofold thing. You want to make your core line of beers that are available to a broad palette, but then you also have to stay relevant and do different things to kind of bring that beer geek attention back to you and make you relevant in the scene. So.
What is it about the process for the second beer, the red ale, that makes it a little bit more cloudy and has a little bit more mouthfeel? Like it's really...
Okay, so that every beer, if you really strip down the ingredients and how malt is, and I'm not going to get too specific, but every beer has a base malt that looks like the blonde ale,
Okay.
right? And you take a different set of malt, and the more you cook it, the more you roast it, the different flavors are going to come out, the darker it's going to get when you actually add it to the beer. So you take a base that kind of looks like this, and they don't start out that way. You throw all the grain in at once, so you don't start off brewing this and then add color. But just the concept of it is base grain like this, and then you will add some darkening agents that will, or darken, more dark grains that will give different flavor profiles, some caramel malts. The darker you roast it, you can get some coffee. Like if you ever have a stout, it's kind of the same thing. So it's going to have a lot of coffee, chocolate notes, roasty notes to it, and that's just malt that we've taken and really cooked and gotten it kind of burnt, kind of like coffee. It's a lot like coffee, where you have a light roast, you have a medium roast, and you have a dark roast, and each roast will give you different flavor characteristics out of it. And it's the same thing with malt.
Well, thank you, Ian, for a great seminar.
Thank you.